She had worn it around her neck for 26 years. A small iron key on a leather chain, dark with age, smooth from years of being touched without thinking. She never took it off. Not when she was teaching 3rd grade. Not when her father died. Not on the day she signed the divorce papers and watched Harold walk away with the lake house, the investment accounts, and 31 years of her life packed into a settlement she was too tired to fight harder. The key stayed. Harold's attorney had read the remainder aloud after the divorce was finalized. A small checking account, a used Buick, and her father's old gas station out on Route 9 boarded up since 1997, the pumps rusted, the service bay dark and empty. He had smiled when he said it. Not a cruel smile, just the easy smile of a man who had already decided something had no value without ever once stepping inside. Harold had left her a voicemail the night before the final hearing. "The station isn't worth a dime, Ruth. Keep it if you want. Lord knows I don't." She had listened to that message 4 times. She still had it saved. Now she stood in the service bay. Concrete floor, bare walls, the smell of old oil and winter air moving through the gaps in the boarded windows. Her footsteps echoed in a way that made the place feel larger than it looked, as if the building had been waiting for someone to hear it properly. And then she saw it. Set into the back wall, half hidden behind a rusted shelving unit she had to pull aside with both hands, was a concrete door, low and narrow, framed in old steel, 6 steps leading down into the dark, and a padlock through the latch. A padlock she had seen before, the same model, the same weight, the same dull brass color as the key she had worn around her neck for 26 years. Her hand stayed steady as she lifted the chain over her head. She had always assumed the key was sentimental, something her father had pressed into her palm the last summer. He was well with no explanation except the way he looked at her quiet, and certain the way Ray Calloway looked at things he had already decided a long time ago. She slid the key into the lock. It turned. A clean, simple click. The padlock fell open into her hand. Warm, stale air rose from below, not cold, warmer than the bay above, as if the room beneath the station had been holding its breath for years and had finally exhaled. Ruth stood at the top of the 6 concrete steps and looked down into the dark. He had always said he would take care of her. She just hadn't known he meant it like this. The sign was still there. Ruth sat with the engine running for a long moment, looking through the windshield at the faded green and white letters across the top of the building. Calloway's. Her father had painted those letters himself in 1959, the year before she was born, with a steady hand and a 2-inch brush, and the particular kind of quiet confidence he brought to everything he decided to do. The paint had gone thin in places, the white had gone to cream. But the letters were still there, and for reasons she hadn't entirely expected, that felt like something. She shut off the engine. She sat in the silence for another full minute. Then she got out. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier on a Thursday morning that had looked and felt like any other Thursday. The settlement conference had lasted 3.5 hours. Harold's attorney had been thorough, the kind of thorough that speaks to months of careful preparation done while a marriage was still technically intact. Ruth had understood that by the 2nd hour. She had said very little. The marital home went to Harold. His name had been on the primary deed, a detail she had never questioned in 48 years of marriage, the kind of detail that seems administrative until the moment it isn't. The joint investment accounts were divided in the way that favors the person who managed the paperwork, which had always been Harold. Her teacher's pension remained hers, as it always had been. Harold had never shown any interest in her pension. He had always had other assets. When his attorney reached the gas station on the property inventory, he held the page for the length of time it takes to read 4 words. Legacy property, no income, no current appraised value. He had looked up briefly. "We'll leave that with Mrs. Calloway." Harold had not objected. He had not even glanced across the table. Ruth had sat with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing. She had learned in 48 years of marriage to save her words for when they mattered. That conference room had not been the place for them. Now she walked through the station slowly, the way you walk through a place that belongs to memory before it belongs to you. The small front office first, the pegboard still hung with its hand-printed tire prices from 20 years ago, the countertop worn smooth in two places where her father had rested his elbows for 37 years. Then, through the doorway into the two-bay service area, the concrete floor was cracked in a long diagonal from the northeast corner. The oil change calendar on the wall still showed October 1997, the last month Ray Calloway had worked. Someone had circled the 14th in red pen. She didn't know why. The air smelled of old motor oil and dry wood, and something underneath both of those. Something older and quieter, the particular combination of cold concrete and machine grease and weathered wood that she had last noticed when she was 7 years old. And her father had lifted her onto the hood of a customer's Ford to show her how the engine worked. She hadn't thought of that afternoon in decades. The smell brought it back without asking permission. She found a cardboard box in the apartment at the back, his work gloves stiff with age, a fraying almanac from 1994, a coffee can full of miscellaneous keys, cabinet keys, padlock keys, keys to things she couldn't identify and never would. She went through them without hurrying. None of them were iron. None of them had a bow worn smooth from decades of handling. She carried the coffee can back into the service bay and set it on the old parts shelf. She was standing at the far end of the bay near the back wall when she stopped. The concrete door was set directly into the wall, low and heavy, no visible handle, the frame so flush with the surrounding concrete that it almost disappeared into it. She had seen it before, 100 times probably growing up. It had always been simply part of the wall to her, the way certain things in childhood become invisible through familiarity. But today she noticed the gap at the base of the door, an inch of space between the bottom edge and the floor, and through that gap, the suggestion of something 6 concrete steps leading down. She had never noticed the steps before. Ruth stood still for a moment. Then she reached up and touched the iron key on its leather chain. She had found it 26 years ago, folded into a handkerchief in the small box of her father's personal effects that the hospital had returned after he passed. No note, no label, just the key wrapped carefully placed at the top of the box where she would find it first. She had assumed it was sentimental, a key to something long since discarded, or lost, the kind of object a man keeps, because it belonged to a chapter of his life he never entirely closed. She had put it around her neck the afternoon of his funeral and had not taken it off since. She looked at the door. She looked at the key. She did not approach the door. Not yet. Instead, she went back to the apartment, filled the old kettle from the tap. The water ran clear. After a few seconds, the pipes still sound, and set it on her father's stove. The burner caught on the second turn. She hadn't known the gas was still connected. Harold's attorney had not thought to appraise the stove. She made tea and sat down at Ray's kitchen table, the one she had done homework at as a girl, the surface still faintly marked with the rings of 100 coffee mugs and the ghost of a pen scratch where she had pressed too hard in the 3rd grade. She lifted the iron key from the chain and held it up in the lamplight. She had never looked at it this directly before, not as a relic, as a key. Flat bow, slightly worn on the left side from years of contact with the same place on her collarbone. Single barrel, smooth, no ornamentation. The kind of key made before 1950 possibly. Before 1940 she had no way to know, but she had taught enough history to recognize the shape of an era. She set it down on the table beside her mug and looked at it for a long time. The padlock on that concrete door was the same age. She was certain of it now. She had looked at it long enough to be certain. Before we go any further, if something in Ruth's story feels familiar to you, the feeling of a house that holds more than it shows, or a father who said less than he meant, this channel was made for you. Every week we find another room that was sealed too long. Subscribe so you're here when the next one opens. She had worn the answer around her neck since the year her father died. She had never once thought to look down. She did not sit in the car this time. Ruth parked in the same spot she had used the day before, force of habit, the same cracked section of asphalt her father had always used himself, and got out while the sky was still gray. The October dawn came slowly out here, the flat Ohio light easing up behind the tree line without ceremony. She had been awake since 4. She had not tried very hard to sleep. She unlocked the front office with the key from the coffee can, left the overhead light off, and walked straight through to the service bay. Her footsteps on the concrete sounded the same as yesterday. The oil change calendar still showed October 1997. The cracked floor still ran its long diagonal from corner to corner. The concrete door at the back wall looked exactly as it had always looked, low, frameless, set flush into the wall, the padlock centered at chest height. She walked to it without pausing. Ruth lifted the iron key from the chain around her neck, lifting the leather loop over her head, for the first time since the afternoon of her father's funeral 26 years ago. She held the key for a moment in her open palm. It was lighter than she expected, or perhaps she had simply forgotten the weight of it, now that it wasn't resting against her sternum. The bow was worn smooth on the left side from decades of contact with the same place on her collarbone. She had done that. She had worn that smoothness into it one ordinary day at a time for 26 years. She inserted the key into the padlock. It met resistance. The oxidation of decades, she could feel it in the tumblers, a stiffness that wasn't mechanical failure, but simply time, the way old things resist the first moment of being used again. She did not force it. Her father had told her once when she was 9 years old and impatient with a rusted bicycle lock that a stiff mechanism wants patience, not pressure. "You're not fighting the lock," he had said. "You're reminding it what it was made for." She worked the key gently. Back a quarter turn, forward. A little pressure, then release. The tumblers shifted again. The padlock released with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. A clean, simple click, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, certain sound of something that had been waiting a very long time, finally deciding. The shackle swung free. Ruth unhooked it from the latch and held it in her hand for a moment, feeling its weight, and then set it on the floor beside her foot. The concrete door swung inward on its own weight, slow and steady, the hinges silent. Cold air rose from below. Not the cold of neglect, not the cold of something rotting or forgotten, but a different kind of cold entirely. Preserved, sealed. The air of a room that had been closed against the world deliberately and completely, and had simply waited. She found the light switch on the left side of the doorframe, a standard toggle, the kind her father had installed throughout the station in the early 1960s. She flipped it. Nothing. She descended 2 steps and found the pull chain in the dark, exactly where it would have been if her father had hung it himself halfway down at shoulder height. She pulled it. A single bulb came on. Warm yellow light, stronger than she expected, filling a space that was 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep. Concrete walls, concrete floor, concrete ceiling, low and smooth, poured with the same care as the walls. She stood at the base of the 6 steps and looked at the room her father had built. He had poured this himself. She understood that immediately, looking at the construction, the clean joints, the careful finish on the walls, the way the shelves on the left side were formed directly from the concrete rather than added afterward. This was not a room someone had discovered or repurposed. Her father had designed it, formed it, and poured it with specific intention. It was built like a vault. On the left wall, 3 concrete shelves ran the full length of the room. Each shelf held brown paper packets tied with twine, not the original twine she noticed. The packets had been retied, at some point the twine fresh and uniform compared to what she would have expected from documents stored since the 1940s. Her father had come down here, recently enough to replace the twine. On the right wall, a metal 2-drawer filing cabinet, gray, the paint worn at the corners. A separate padlock through the drawer handles. She did not have the key for that one. Not yet. In the center of the room, a small wooden work table, the same type her father had used in the station's back office, plain and square, and built for function. 1 folding chair. On the table, a neat stack of notebooks covered by a canvas dust cloth, the kind used to protect equipment from long storage. And on top of the canvas cloth, placed where it would be found, immediately placed, where nothing could be set down on the table without moving it first, a white envelope. Ruth descended the last step and stood before the table. She read her father's handwriting in pencil on the front of the envelope. For Ruth, When you need it. She sat down on the concrete step behind her and held the envelope in both hands. She did not open it. She was not ready to open it. She understood sitting there in the yellow light with the cold air around her and the weight of 26 years in her hands, that some things needed a moment before they could be received. Her father had known that about her. He had always known exactly how much time she needed. She set the envelope back on the table, carefully, exactly where she had found it. Then she turned to the notebooks beneath the canvas cloth and lifted one corner of the fabric. The notebooks were uniform, brown covers, each one labeled in her father's careful hand. She read the first label, Parcel Records. 1944 to 1952. She moved to the next. 1953 to 1961. The next. 1962 to 1971. She worked along the stack, slowly reading each label in turn. 9 notebooks. She stood still for a moment, her hand resting on the last one. Her father had started keeping these records in 1944. Ruth had been born in 1951. He had been building this room, filling it, organizing it, maintaining it before she existed, before she had a name to put on an envelope. He had started before she was born and had not stopped until he couldn't come down the steps anymore. 45 years of records kept in a sealed concrete room under the floor of a gas station that Harold's attorney had looked at for 4 seconds and decided had no value. The room had not been forgotten. It had been tended. The shelves were organized, the packets retied, the filing cabinet wiped clean. Her father had come down here alone in silence on ordinary days between oil changes and tire rotations and closing up the station for the night, and he had kept this room exactly as he intended it to be found. She understood now what the key had always been. Not a relic, not a sentimental object. A responsibility passed from one careful hand to another with no explanation because none had been necessary. Her father had not kept this room for himself. He had never intended to open it at all. He had kept it for one specific morning, a morning he could not have named, could not have predicted, could only have prepared for, with the particular patience of a man who had lived through hard enough years to know that hard years come back around. This morning, this one. She worked the way she had always worked through something unfamiliar. Start from the beginning, establish context. Don't skip ahead. Ruth settled into the folding chair at her father's work table with her reading glasses on and her notepad open to a fresh page, and she opened the first notebook. The single bulb above cast its warm yellow light across the pages. She had found her father's old thermos in the work table drawer, the green one she remembered from childhood, still carrying the faint ghost of coffee smell that no amount of time had entirely removed. She had filled it from the tap upstairs and brewed tea on the old stove before coming back down. She set the thermos on the table beside the notepad and began to read. Her father's handwriting was precise and compressed. The handwriting of a man who had grown up in a time when paper cost something and waste of any kind was a habit you couldn't afford. Each letter formed cleanly, each line ruled straight without a ruler. Each entry separated by a single horizontal mark, drawn with the deliberate care of someone who understood that records were only useful if you could find what you needed in them. The first notebook covered 1944 to 1952, property records, not financial records in the broad sense, specifically land parcel records. Each entry followed the same format: a parcel number, a legal description written out in full, a date of acquisition, a price paid, a county registration date. She copied the format into her notepad and worked through the entries one by one. The parcels were small. In the early years, very small, half-acre plots, strips of land running adjacent to the station's lot, occasional roadside pieces that wouldn't have caught anyone's professional attention. Nothing that looked like investment strategy. Nothing that looked like anything except what it was: a Depression-era man quietly buying whatever scraps of ground came available when the price was right, because he had learned in his bones that you could lose a business, lose a house, lose a marriage, but land stayed. His generation had learned that lesson at a cost Ruth had never personally paid, and she had always known her father carried it. She had simply never seen the evidence laid out like this, entry by entry, year after year, in a sealed room he had never mentioned. She worked through the second notebook. The parcels grew slightly larger through the 1950s, the prices reflecting post-war land values, the descriptions becoming more precise. She noted everything. She photographed every page with her phone working, slowly making sure each image was legible before moving on. She was midway through the third notebook, the volume covering 1962 to 1971, when she stopped. The entry looked like the others at first glance: parcel number, legal description, date, price, county registration. But beside the parcel number in the right margin, her father had added a second notation she hadn't seen in the earlier volumes: MR 1,200 feet. She went back a page. The same notation, different number, MR 800 feet. She flipped back further. The notation appeared consistently beginning around 1961, added to some parcels, but not others, always in the same format. MR followed by a depth measurement in feet. She looked at the numbers: 800 feet, 1,200 feet, 1,400, 1,150. The depths varied but fell within the same general range. She wrote MR in her notepad and put a question mark beside it. She didn't know yet what it meant, but her father had been marking it carefully, parcel by parcel, depth by depth, for nearly 30 years. A man who kept records like this was not keeping them for himself. She worked through all 9 notebooks in a single sitting. 4 hours, the thermos of tea going lukewarm and then cold beside her, the notepad filling with her own careful observations. When she closed the final notebook and set it back in its place on the stack, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the sealed room and looked at what she had written down. 45 years of acquisitions, dozens of parcels, and that notation MR appearing in the records for 3 decades without explanation. She picked up her phone and called Paul. He answered on the second ring. She could hear his television in the background, the particular mid-morning sound of cable news that had become the soundtrack of his retirement. Dad kept records down here for 45 years, she said. Property records, dozens of parcels, Paul, all filed at the county. Paul's response came immediately with the easy certainty of someone who has already decided the shape of a situation. Dad was a pack rat, Ruth. Always was. You know that. Don't go building mysteries out of old notebooks. Ruth looked at the 9 notebooks stacked in front of her, at the 4 hours of notes in her own hand, at the photographs on her phone, 243 pages of her father's precise, compressed handwriting recording, decades of deliberate, systematic work. I'm not building anything, she said. I'm reading. She hung up. She reached for the first brown paper packet on the left side shelf, the one labeled in pencil in her father's hand, 1962. She set it on the work table and untied the twine slowly, the same patience she had used on the padlock the morning before. The packet unfolded into a small stack of documents, each one paper clipped to a county registration receipt. She lifted the top document and put on her reading glasses. It was a deed transfer form. Standard county format, the kind she had seen before, in context that had always seemed abstract to her property law title work, the administrative machinery of ownership that ran quietly in the background of ordinary life. She read the legal description. Then she read the transferee field. She read it twice. Ruth Ann Calloway. Her name, her full name, in her father's handwriting in the transferee field of a legal deed transfer dated March 14th, 1962. She had been 11 years old on March 14th, 1962. She had been in 5th grade. She had been worried, she remembered with sudden and specific clarity, about a geography test that Friday the state capitals, which she had never been able to keep straight west of the Mississippi. Her father had been thinking about this for her entire childhood. She opened the next packet, 1963. A different parcel, a different legal description, and in the transferee field the same name. Ruth Ann Calloway, the next, 1965. Her name again, 1967. Her name, 1969, 1971, 1974. 7 deed transfers, 7 separate parcels, all transferred into her name, all filed at the county, all perfectly legal and not one of them had appeared on any property inventory in her divorce proceeding. Because Harold's attorney had spent 4 seconds on the gas station and moved on. Because the gas station was a legacy property with no income and no current appraised value, and there was nothing below it worth looking at. She stopped counting after 7 and sat very still for a moment. Ruth Ann Calloway. Her father had never used her married name on these documents, not once across 45 years of careful record-keeping. He had always written Ruth Ann Calloway her maiden name, the name she had carried into the marriage, and set aside so gradually that she had barely noticed the setting aside. He had always known, perhaps, that the other name was temporary. She picked up her phone, not Paul this time. She scrolled to a number she hadn't called in several years, a number she had kept, because some people you simply kept regardless of the distance that accumulated between visits. It rang 4 times before a man's voice answered, slightly hoarse with age, but sharp underneath. "Walter Blythe," she said. "It's Ruth Calloway. I'm at the station. I need to ask you something about my father." Walter Blythe's truck was older than some marriages. Ruth heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of an engine that had been maintained with discipline rather than replaced a low, steady rattle that announced its arrival the way old things do without apology. She was standing in the front office when he pulled into the lot, and she watched through the dusty window as he parked in the spot closest to the bay door, the same spot she realized he had used every working morning for 27 years. He sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the Calloway's sign. Then he got out. He moved carefully the way a man of 77 moves when his body has kept an honest account of decades of physical work, not slowly out of weakness, but slowly out of the earned knowledge that careful movement is its own form of competence. His hands were a mechanic's hands, still wide and deliberate, but his eyes, when Ruth opened the door to meet him, were the eyes of a man who had forgotten nothing in half a century of watching engines and people. He looked at her for a moment before she could say anything. "I always wondered when you'd come back here," he said. She led him through the front office and the service bay without explaining where they were going. She simply walked. Walter followed, glancing around the bay as they passed through the cracked floor, the old calendar, the bare walls, with the quiet attention of someone reviewing a place they had held in memory for a long time. She pulled aside the rusted shelving unit. The concrete door was open. The light below was on. Walter stood at the top of the 6 steps and looked down. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he descended 1 step at a time and stood in the center of the room. His eyes moved from the shelves to the filing cabinet, to the work table, to the stacked notebooks, to the envelope still resting where Ruth had placed it back, undisturbed. He turned slowly, taking inventory the way a mechanic assesses a job methodically, without rushing the conclusion. He was not surprised. He was relieved. "I knew it was here," Walter said. He sat down in the folding chair without being invited because he was 77 years old and had earned the right to sit when he needed to. "Your father never said what was in it, but I knew it was here, and I knew it was for you." Ruth sat on the concrete step and looked at him. "Tell me about the room." Walter folded his hands on his knees. "Your father built it in the winter of 1961. Said he was putting in a storage room under the service bay, came in one Monday morning and told me the way he'd tell me anything plain. One time, no discussion. He did the work on Sundays when we were closed. Took him 3 months." He paused. He never asked for help. The room had been built in the winter of 1961. Ruth had brought Harold home for the first time in the summer of that year, 4th of July weekend, her father's birthday. Her father had shaken Harold's hand on the porch, looked at him once, in the careful way he looked at everything, and never said a word about him that Ruth could recall. No warning, no complaint, no interference. He had simply come in the following Monday and told Walter he was building a room. "Did he ever say why?" Ruth asked. Walter considered this for a moment. Not the pause of a man searching for an answer, the pause of a man deciding how precisely to deliver one he had been holding for a long time. He said Walter began and then stopped and then started again more slowly. A man who builds on someone else's foundation has to hope that foundation holds. I prefer to build my own. He quoted it the way people quote things they have been turning over in their minds for 60 years carefully, like something they had been waiting for the right moment to pass along. Greta called back in 20 minutes. Ruth was still at the work table, the 15 mineral rights conveyances arranged in front of her when her phone rang. She answered before the second ring. Greta Olson's voice was professional, the measured, careful tone of a woman who had spent a career handling information with precision. But Ruth had been a school teacher for 31 years. She knew how to hear what was underneath a careful tone. "I've pulled all 15 parcels," Greta said. "Every conveyance is correctly filed and currently registered in the name of Ruth Ann Calloway. Each one is continuous, no lapses, no breaks in the record, no competing claims. They've been maintained in the county record exactly as filed." A brief pause. "They're clean, Mrs. Calloway. Every single one." Ruth let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. "But I need to tell you something else," Greta said, "something separate from the deeds themselves." Ruth sat down in the folding chair. For the past 3 years, Greta explained a county pipeline expansion project had been in active negotiations for a permanent easement across mineral rights in this specific area, a corridor running through several parcels in the 3-mile radius around Route 9. The county attorney's office had been working to identify and contact the registered owner of several of the affected parcels. The search had been ongoing. It had been complicated. The name in the record was Ruth Ann Calloway. That name had not matched any current county resident. Ruth had been Ruth Calloway under her married name for 48 years on her driver's license, her pension records, her property tax filings. Ruth Ann Calloway existed only in one place, a filing cabinet in a sealed concrete room under a gas station that Harold's attorney had looked at for 4 seconds and decided had no value. The county had been looking for her for 3 years. She had been there the whole time. After she hung up, Ruth sat alone in the room for a long moment. The 15 files were spread across the table in front of her. The single bulb burned overhead. Outside, somewhere above the service bay ceiling, the October morning was going about its business without her. She reached for the white envelope. It was still exactly where she had placed it back on the second morning, on top of the canvas cloth centered on the work table, her father's penciled handwriting facing up. "For Ruth, when you need it." She opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages written on station letterhead. Calloway's Gas and Service printed in the same green and white as the sign above the lot, the address below it in smaller type. Route 9, the zip code she had memorized at age 6. The paper had the particular texture of a good stationery, kept in a dry place, firm, slightly yellowed at the edges, but not brittle. Her father had chosen the paper deliberately. Of course he had. The date at the top, November 12, 1996. Her father had died in February 1997. He had written this letter 3 months before the end. Ruth took off her reading glasses, cleaned them with the hem of her sweater, and put them back on. Then she began to read. Ray Calloway was not a man of long words. He had never been. He expressed things through action and duration, and the quiet accumulation of kept promises, not through sentences. But the sentences he did write were his completely plain exact, without decoration, carrying the weight of a man who chose each word the way he chose each tool for the specific job it needed to do. He wrote that he had known since the first evening he met Harold that Harold was a man who counted everything he touched and expected it to appreciate. He did not say this with anger. He stated it the way he would state the compression ratio of an engine as a fact identified through observation recorded for practical purposes. He wrote that he had never said anything to Ruth because he did not believe in interfering with a woman's choices. He had raised her to make her own decisions. He respected that. He always had. But he believed in being ready. So he had spent 30 years being ready. He listed the parcel numbers, each one in the same compressed handwriting as the notebooks, all 15, with their county registration numbers and filing dates. He wrote the location at the county recorder's office. He wrote the cabinet number and the drawer. He had thought about whether she would be able to find everything, and he had written the instructions for finding it as clearly as he would write directions to a job site. Then at the bottom of the 3rd page, in slightly larger letters than the rest, as if he had wanted to be sure this part was legible, as if he had written it last and taken extra care, The ground under this station is not worthless, Ruth. I made sure of that. I made sure it was yours and nobody else's. If you're reading this, you needed it. I hope I got it right." Ruth read it twice. Then she folded the letter along its original creases, the folds her father had made in November 1996, still sharp after 27 years, and held it in both hands. He had written this letter knowing he was writing it toward the end. The handwriting in the final pages was slightly slower than his usual hand, not trembling, just careful the deliberateness of a man conserving what he had left. He had used what time remained not to say goodbye, not to settle old grievances or unburden his conscience or leave behind the kind of letter people write when they are afraid of being forgotten. He had used it to make sure the instructions were clear. That was Ray Calloway's version of a goodbye. Ruth sat in the folding chair in the sealed room under the floor of her father's gas station, in the yellow light of the single bulb he had wired himself in 1961, and she held his letter and looked at the Calloway's letterhead and said to the room quietly to no one, and to the only person who mattered, "You got it right, Daddy. You got it exactly right." She sat with that for a while. The October light shifted above her, moving through the cracked window of the service bay in the slow way of late-season light, unhurried and fading. She did not know how long she sat there. Long enough. Then she opened the second drawer of the filing cabinet one more time and found what she had not yet found at the very bottom. Beneath the hanging files lying flat against the drawer floor, a small manila envelope sealed labeled in pencil in her father's hand. "Stock certificates, Union Valley Utilities." She opened it carefully. Inside 12 stock certificates, each one printed in the formal typeface of mid-century financial documents, each one issued between 1968 and 1974, each one in the name of Ruth Ann Calloway. At the bottom of each certificate in the transferring agent field, Raymond C. Calloway signed in his plain, unhurried hand. She did not know yet what Union Valley Utilities was. She did not know that the pipeline project Greta Olson had described, the county expansion that had been searching for her name for 3 years, was operated by a company that had absorbed Union Valley Utilities in 1989, 36 years ago. She did not know that her father had bought these certificates in 1968, the same year the first pipeline survey maps for this corridor had been filed in a county planning office that no one outside the county had paid attention to. She didn't know any of that yet. She just held the 12 certificates in both hands, looked at her name printed on every one of them, and set them carefully on the table beside her father's letter. Ray Calloway had never bought anything without a reason. She had learned that much in the last 3 days. Greta Olson was already at the table when Ruth arrived. The county land records office occupied the second floor of a building that had not changed much since the 1970s. Linoleum floors, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional quiet of a place where important things were routinely confirmed without ceremony. Greta had pulled a chair to the side of the table rather than sitting across from it, which Ruth noticed and appreciated. It was the arrangement of someone who intended to work alongside, not opposite. The folder Greta had assembled was thick. She set it on the table between them with the careful deliberateness of a person who understood that documents are not simply paper. They are people's lives, made legible decisions and intentions and years of quiet work reduced to recorded fact and therefore protected by it. "I pulled everything I could find," Greta said. The complete chain of title for each parcel, the mineral rights conveyances going back to the original filings and the county pipeline project documentation. She opened the folder to the first tab. "We'll go through them in order." They spent 2 hours at that table. The records confirmed everything in Ray's notebooks and letter parcel by parcel, year by year. Each conveyance filed correctly, each registration maintained without lapse. Each parcel boundary described with the legal precision of a man who had learned early that imprecise paperwork was the thing most likely to undo careful work. Her father had not made a single clerical error in 30 years of filings, not one. When they reached the pipeline documentation, Greta walked Ruth through it slowly. The county-approved expansion required a permanent subsurface easement across 11 of Ruth's 15 mineral rights parcels, a corridor running northeast from Route 9 in the direction the notebooks had described, the depth measurements in Ray's MR notations corresponding exactly to the project's specified extraction level. The easement negotiations had been in progress for 3 years. They had stalled repeatedly on a single procedural obstacle. The county attorney's office could not definitively confirm that Ruth Ann Calloway, the name on the registered deeds, and any currently living locatable person were the same individual. A married woman is sometimes harder to find than she should be. Ruth had been 40 minutes away for 48 years, filing taxes, paying property insurance on the station every year without examining what the station contained, going to church on Sundays, teaching 3rd grade, living her life under a name that had nothing wrong with it except that it wasn't the one her father had used. 2 days earlier, that connection had been made, Greta's search, Ruth's call, the parcel number read aloud over the phone. Dennis Finch, the county pipeline project attorney, had been notified that morning. He had asked for a meeting at Ruth's earliest convenience. Ruth said she would call him that afternoon. She gathered the folder, thanked Greta, and walked out to the parking lot. The October air was cold and direct. She stood beside her car for a moment, looking at the street, and then called Paul. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been waiting. She did not build to it. She read him the parcel numbers, all 15, in order the way her father had listed them in the letter. She told him what the mineral rights were. She told him about the pipeline project, and the 3-year search, and the meeting with Dennis Finch. She told him about the stock certificates. She gave him all of it plainly, without emphasis, without accusation, the way she would explain a document to a careful reader. Paul was silent for a long moment. She could hear his breathing on the other end of the line, the particular quality of a silence that belongs to someone who is recalculating something significant. "Dad never said a word," he said finally. "No," Ruth said. "He never did." Another silence, longer this time. "Ruth!" Paul's voice had changed. Something had gone out of it, the easy certainty she had heard on the phone 4 days earlier, when he had told her she was building mysteries out of old notebooks. What replaced it was quieter and less comfortable. "I told Harold you were being sentimental, about the station, when the settlement was being worked out." He paused. "I thought you were just being sentimental." Ruth looked out the car window at the street. A woman walked past with a small dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Ordinary Tuesday morning going about its business. She thought about the right answer. Not the satisfying answer, the right one. "You didn't know," she said. "Neither did I." She meant it entirely. Paul hadn't done it to hurt her. She understood that. He had looked at the gas station the same way Harold's attorney had. 4 seconds old property, cracked lot, no income, not worth the conversation. He had believed what he saw because what he saw was all he had looked at. What none of them had done was go downstairs. She hung up and went back inside. Greta was still at the table, the folder open to the last tab, the stock certificates. She had been running the search while Ruth was in the parking lot. Ruth sat down. "Union Valley Utilities," Greta said. She turned the folder so Ruth could see the page she had found, an acquisition record, dated 1989, the formal corporate language of a merger filing. In 1989, Union Valley Utilities was acquired by a regional energy company. She set one of Ruth's stock certificates beside the acquisition record. That company is the parent organization of the pipeline project. Ruth looked at the 2 documents side by side. The certificate in her father's name as transferring agent signed in 1968. The acquisition record from 1989. The pipeline project documentation from the current county file. 3 separate documents, 3 separate decades forming a chain that her father could not possibly have intended and yet had positioned her exactly within. She sat with that for a moment. "He bought those in 1968, Ruth said. "He couldn't have known." Greta looked at her. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing their words with care. "No," she said. "But he bought them?" The certificates lay on the table between them. 12 of them issued across 6 years, each one in Ruth Ann Calloway's name, each one signed by Raymond C. Calloway in his plain, unhurried hand. Ruth had been right about almost nothing in the past several weeks. The settlement, the lake house, the accounts, the 31 years of paperwork she had trusted to someone else. She had been wrong about what could be taken from her, and wrong about what she had been left with. But Ray Calloway, it was becoming clear, had been right about almost everything. If Ray Calloway's quiet 40-year plan is staying with you, there are more stories like this waiting on this channel. Old properties, sealed rooms, parents who planned in silence for the children they loved. Subscribe and stay close. Dennis Finch arrived on a Thursday morning with a briefcase and the particular expression of a man who has spent 3 years looking for someone and has finally found them. He was younger than Ruth had expected, mid-50s, careful in his movements, the kind of attorney who had learned that thorough was more useful than fast. He shook her hand with both of his when she met him at the station door. Then he looked around the service bay, the cracked floor, the old calendar, the bare walls, the concrete door standing open at the back, and took it in without hurry. "Your father was very thorough," he said. "Yes," Ruth said. "He was." She led him downstairs. Dennis set his briefcase on the work table and looked around the room, the same way Walter had slowly taken inventory, giving the space the attention it deserved. He did not comment on the construction or the age of it or the improbability of its existence beneath a gas station that Harold's attorney had dismissed in 4 seconds. He simply opened his briefcase and laid out his documents beside Ruth's, and they sat down across from each other in the yellow light of the single bulb and went to work. He walked her through the pipeline project in full, not the abbreviated version, not the version an attorney delivers to someone he has assessed as a minor procedural obstacle. Ruth was not a minor obstacle. She was the primary rights holder for 11 of the 15 parcels the project required, and Dennis Finch was professional enough to understand the difference between those two situations and adjust accordingly. He took her through the project history, the easement requirements, the county authorization process, and the basis for the compensation assessment with the same care he would give a sophisticated client who had been expecting his call. She listened without interrupting. She had been a teacher long enough to know that the most important part of receiving information was not the questions you asked during it, but the ones you formed while you were quiet. When he finished, he slid a single page across the work table. The preliminary easement agreement, the county's assessed fair value compensation for the permanent subsurface easement across her 11 parcels, calculated according to the standard methodology, documented and defensible and ready for her attorney's review. Ruth picked up the page and read the figure. She set it back down on the table. She did not react to it immediately. She looked at it for a long moment, the number sitting on the page beside her father's neatly listed parcel numbers in the clean, institutional typeface of a county legal document representing the assessed value of ground her father had filed documents on once a year for 30 years in a county recorder's office alone, without telling anyone. It was not a fortune. It was not the kind of number that changes the shape of a life overnight. But it was a careful, county-assessed, legally defensible number, and it was more substantially more than the appraised value of the marital home Harold had received in the divorce settlement. The lake house he had walked out of the conference room with while his attorney smiled his easy smile, and Ruth had said nothing. She did not call Harold. She did not call Paul. She set the page back on the table and sat with it for a full minute in silence. Dennis also confirmed the Union Valley Utilities succession. The stock certificates were valid. The share succession documented through the 1989 acquisition. The current value compounded from the original 1968 certificates, representing an additional sum that would require a separate calculation but was not negligible. Ruth asked the question she needed to ask. Did anyone ever come looking for these rights during my father's lifetime? Dennis checked his timeline. The pipeline project had been first proposed in 2018. Ray Calloway had died in February 1997. He had died 21 years before anyone proposed the project. He had built the room in 1961. He had filed the first deed in 1962. He had driven to the county recorder's office alone once a year for 30 years, filing mineral rights conveyances into his daughter's name for no specific financial reason that had ever materialized in his lifetime. The ground under the station had not been worth anything particular when he started. It had not been worth anything particular when he died. He had done all of it without knowing. He had done it anyway. Ruth was quiet for a moment. He built this room in 1961, she said. He filed the first deed in 1962. He died in 1997. He never told anyone. Dennis said, "He told you." Ruth looked at the room around her, the concrete walls her father had poured on Sundays, the shelves he had built, and maintained the notebooks he had kept for 45 years, the envelope he had placed where it would be found first. "He told the county recorder's office," she said. "He told the padlock." She almost smiled at this. Almost. Not at Harold, not at the divorce, not at any of it. She almost smiled because Ray Calloway had been so exactly himself. Right down to the end, a man who expressed things through action and duration and sealed concrete rooms rather than words, who had spent 30 years being right for no reason, except that he believed in being right, and who had trusted a padlock and a county filing system to deliver his message when the time came. Dennis left her with the preliminary agreement and said there was no rush. The county had waited 3 years. They could wait a few more weeks for her to review everything with her own attorney. She thanked him. She walked him through the service bay and out to the lot and watched his car pull onto Route 9 and disappear. The October sky was the flat gray of a day that couldn't decide on itself. The Calloway's sign was the same faded green and white it had always been. She went back inside. She stood at the top of the concrete steps for a long moment, looking down at the room. The 15 files still spread across the work table. The easement agreement beside her father's letter. The single bulb burning warm in the cold air below. The project had been proposed in 2018. Ray had died in 1997. He had built the room, filed the deeds, written the letter, and sealed the door, 21 years before the ground beneath it became worth anything specific. He had been right for the same reason he had always been right about things, not because he had information others lacked, but because he had paid attention and acted on what he saw, and kept acting long after most people would have stopped. She descended the steps one more time. The room was the same. The files were the same. The work table, the folding chair, the single bulb, her father's letter on the table where she had left it. The only thing different was that she knew now what her father had known for 60 years. This room was always going to be enough. He had always known it was going to be enough. She came alone. Paul had offered the night before in the careful voice of a man who understood he was offering something he did not entirely deserve to offer. Ruth had said no, not unkindly, not with any edge in it, just simply. This visit was for one person, and one person who was no longer here, and she had learned in the past 6 weeks to be precise about what she needed and from whom. She parked in the same spot. The October sky had given way to November, the light thinner now, the tree growing through the back fence stripped down to its skeleton. The Calloway's sign was the same faded green and white it had always been. She looked at it through the windshield for a moment, the way she had on the first morning, and then she got out without sitting. She unlocked the front office, walked through the service bay without turning on the overhead light, and went downstairs. The room was exactly as she had left it. She had not moved anything after Dennis Finch's visit, the 15 files still fanned across the work table, her father's letter in its envelope beside them, the 9 notebooks stacked in their order on the canvas cloth. The single bulb cast its warm yellow light across everything. The air was the same preserved cold, the same sealed stillness of a space that had been kept rather than abandoned. Ruth sat down in the folding chair and put her hands in her lap and let the room be what it was. The easement documents had been reviewed by her attorney, a woman in her 60s who had practiced property law for 30 years, and who had read through Ray's notebooks and filings with the expression of someone encountering craftsmanship they had not expected. Everything was in order. The compensation would close in 30 days. The stock certificate succession had been confirmed. The combined value calculated, the numbers set against each other on a single page that Ruth had read twice and then folded into her bag without discussing with anyone who didn't need to know. It was enough to purchase a house outright, in her name only, in the same county where she had taught school for 31 years. She would not be starting over. She would be starting clear. She reached for her father's letter. She had read it 4 times since the morning she had opened it. She did not read it now to look for anything new. She read it to be in his company one more time through his words, the particular company of a man who had expressed himself through action and duration and sealed concrete rooms, and who had, in the last autumn of his life, sat down at a kitchen table somewhere and put his careful compressed handwriting to 3 pages of station letterhead to make sure she would know. She read through the parcel numbers, the filing instructions, the county recorder's address. She read the final paragraph. Then she went back slower and read a line she had moved through quickly. On earlier readings, a line that sat in the middle of the second page between the practical instructions and the closing. Your mother always said I worried too much. Maybe I did. But I'd rather worry for 60 years and be wrong than not worry at all and leave you with nothing. Ruth held the letter in her lap and looked at the room. Her father had come down here alone in silence on ordinary days for 30 years, between oil changes, after closing, on winter Sundays when the station was quiet and no one was watching. He had checked the files and maintained the room and renewed the padlock and kept everything exactly as he intended it to be found. He had never told Ruth's mother. He had never told Paul. He had never told Walter, who had worked beside him for 27 years and had known the room existed and had kept that knowledge the way faithful people keep things quietly without being asked. He had simply trusted that one day she would stand at the top of those steps with the right key at the right moment in the right kind of need, and that she would come down. She sat in the folding chair in the sealed room under her father's gas station for a long time. Long enough to say what needed to be said without words, long enough to let the quiet of the place be what it had always been, not emptiness, but presence. The particular presence of someone who had been paying attention for 60 years and was still in the only way available to him now paying attention still. Then she gathered the contents of the room. She carried the 9 notebooks upstairs first, then the 15 deed files, then the stock certificate folder, and finally her father's letter in its envelope. She drove to the County Historical Society where Greta Olson had arranged for proper preservation archival cases, documented provenance, the official record of Ray Calloway, and what he had built and maintained and left behind. Greta placed the notebooks behind glass herself, setting them in order with the same care she brought to all documents that carried weight. Ray's letter was framed beside them, small and plain and exact the way he had been. The label read Ray Calloway, Calloway's gas station, 1944 to 1996. Ruth stood in front of it for a moment. Then she left. She had kept one thing, the iron key back on its leather chain, back over her head, back against her sternum where it had lived for 26 years. She had worn it for 2.5 decades, not because it opened something. She had worn it because it was his. That had not changed. That would not change. She had never needed the key to be anything other than what it was. On the drive home, she passed the lot where the marital house had stood. Harold had sold it quickly. He was efficient, always had been. The new owners had already changed the shutters. She noticed this in the 2 seconds it took to pass, and then the lot was behind her, and she did not slow down, and she did not look back. There was nothing there for her now. There never had been. Not really. The thing that had always been hers was 6 concrete steps underground in a room no one had bothered to look at behind a padlock that matched a key she had been wearing since the year her father died. She had never been left with nothing. That was the thing, the fact she was still absorbing 6 weeks later on a quiet November morning on a county road she had driven her whole life. Even in the conference room, even across the table from Harold's attorney with his 4-second appraisal and his easy smile, even signing the settlement with her hands folded and her words saved. She had been wearing the answer around her neck the entire time. She had just needed the right morning to put the key in the lock. Ray Calloway never got to see that morning. He built the room, and he sealed it, and he wrote the letter, and he trusted the long, quiet, unwitnessed trust of a man who understood that some things take longer than a lifetime to arrive. And Ruth Calloway at 74, with a divorce behind her and a key around her neck, and 30 days until closing, had walked down those steps and found exactly what he had always intended her to find. Not just the deeds, not just the letter, not just the ground that turned out to be worth something. She had found proof that someone had been paying attention, that someone for 60 years had been thinking of her, that she had never, not for a single moment of her life, not even the hardest ones, been left with nothing. She stopped the car in the station lot one last time before the keys were transferred. She walked to the sign. She stood in front of the faded green and white letters Calloway's painted by her father's hand in 1959, the year before she was born, the year before any of this had started. She put one hand on the wooden post. The paint was rough under her palm, worn thin in places, still holding in others. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The iron key rested against her coat, small and smooth and worn to the shape of 26 years of being carried. She stood there in the November light for a long moment. Then she got back in her car and she drove toward home. If Ray Calloway's quiet 60-year plan moved you, if that image of a man driving alone to the county recorder's office once a year for 30 years stayed with you, please subscribe to Old House Secrets. And tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life who protected you quietly without ever saying so, who built a floor under you that you didn't know was there until you needed it? I want to hear about them.